all yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Priyanka. Thanks to the organizers. Okay. Good day to everyone who's attending this panel. Yeah, better? Yeah, thanks.
We can't see you very well because somebody's sharing the screen. So. Okay, never mind.
Yeah, so this is Ranjita here on the podium, but yeah, I'm afraid that we have to be content with this view. Can't see me in close up. I'm sorry about that. Is that because Nicolina is sharing the screen?
No, she stopped. She stopped. Thanks, Nicolina.
Okay. All right, let's get on with this. Good day, everyone, people who are in this room and all of you who are joining us virtually. Welcome to this panel organized by the CGIAR Gender Platform and the International Rice Research Institute. It is a challenge to keep people awake after a nice lunch and in a cozy room like this, but let's see what we can do to manage that. I am Ranjita Puskur. I call myself an agricultural research for development professional, and I have been working with the CGIAR, the consultative group on international agricultural research, for almost 20 years across Africa, Asia, and Pacific. And I work on gender and livelihoods. Agri-food systems world over are experiencing significant transformations. And this is due to several drivers. Climate change, migration, urbanization are some of those. And this has significant implications for livelihoods and employment of women and the young people engaging in these systems. So the Commission on the Status of Women this year, 2022, identified the changing context of climate and environmental risks on the one hand, and the world of work on the other hand, in setting the 2022 agenda for gender equality and women's empowerment. When we see numbers of women engaging in agriculture declining in places like India particularly, but then the fact is that globally still a very large proportion of women, especially rural and in the informal sector, depends significantly on agriculture and food systems for their food, nutrition, and livelihoods. And we are also aware of the disproportionate burden of care and domestic work that affect their pursuit of employment activities. We are also aware, we've seen enough evidence that shows that COVID-19 has impacted women more severely than anyone else, with loss of jobs, livelihoods, amongst plenty of other impacts that they have experienced. Women's mobility for employment livelihoods has always been less compared to men, and that has become much, much worse with this COVID, the pandemic now. And yesterday, we heard in the keynote about the employment challenge of the burgeoning youth population across the developing world, Africa and Asia. And youth seem to be increasingly exiting the agriculture sector, at least, yeah. And we saw that in case of India, some numbers which were shared with us yesterday, only 35% of male youth are engaged in agriculture, but 48% of female youth still are. The rates are declining, but they are still pretty high. And then there is this gender gap there as well. And we also saw glimpses of wage gap in this sector and beyond. The recent report, the 2021 report of the high-level panel of experts on youth, says poor access to land, natural resources, infrastructure, finance, technology, knowledge, and low remuneration for workers and producers turn youth away from the food systems. As a result, many feel that their best option is to migrate, either to urban areas or even go out of the country. Actions are needed to make the agri-food sector more attractive to young people and to promote their capacities to generate incomes. They're leaving the ag sector because it's not remunerative, does not help them meet their aspirations. But is the non-farm sector able to absorb the women and youth that are exiting the agriculture sector and provide them decent and remunerative livelihoods? Do we have evidence around that? What is the state of livelihoods of these migrants who are getting out of rural areas? Are they getting everything they want and need? And is agriculture a completely no-go option anymore? I mean, the food systems will stay, they will go on, we need them. So, how do we, help transform food systems so that they are supporting these groups of people, women and youth, and they in turn are helping transform them in a way that works for everyone and doesn't leave anyone out. So this panel discussion today focuses on some of these issues and will help us identify research for development priorities that can help generate evidence that is needed to design and promote options for inclusive and resilient livelihoods for young women, young people and women in these food systems. And please do note that I say research for development options and priorities, not just research. This means research that is solution oriented and not just continuing to diagnose problems and be academic about it, not just end up in beautiful journal articles and working papers, which not really used, yeah, or paid attention to. And these challenges that we are talking about are pretty wicked. And that needs interdisciplinary thinking, analysis, and action. No one discipline will suffice. So let's keep that in mind. And we have a star-studded event today, a set of very eminent experts joining us to help us work through some of these questions and challenges. This is a hybrid session. We have some experts who are joining us virtually and will share very snappy and sharp presentations to set the context. And then we will engage in a conversation with some colleagues here to reflect on those presentations and try and address some of the questions that we have and we want to address. So let's start with opening remarks from Dr. Nicolene Dehaan, the director of the CGIAR Gender Platform. Nicolene is a senior researcher with more than 15 years experience and expertise in gender, rural livelihoods, agriculture, and natural resource management. And she has worked in CGIAR and FAO in various positions in her very illustrious career. She has a PhD in rural sociology, and more detailed biographies of all the speakers and panelists are in this beautiful outlet published by the conference organizers. Thank you so much. This is fantastic. Over to Nicolene, please.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to open this interesting and exciting session. I first wanted to talk a little bit about the title of what we're talking about today, which is basically Agri-food Systems Transformation in the Global South, Research for Development, Priorities for Gender Equal and Social Inclusion, Employment and Livelihoods. I want to highlight a few issues there, and I think then we can actually set the scene of what we do as a platform and what we would actually like people in this session also to help us with. And then finally, I do have a request, partly because, as Ranjita pointed out, I am a sociologist and not an economist, but I think there's still a lot of space for the issues that are being discussed in this conference that can help move the needle on gender issues. First of all, gender agriculture. Now we're talking more and more about agri-food systems, which is already a positive thing because gender is very important across the agri-food system. And often when we talk about agriculture, we're talking about productivity, which is often dominated in the conversation as male oriented. And then the last thing is the research. And I think the research is I think, especially important in this part, because we work with the CGIAR, which is a research group of agricultural research centers. We're about 12 centers across the world looking at different aspects of agriculture, whether it's water, whether it's livestock, whether it's rice, Each one has a different mandate, and we as a platform try to bring all that together. And within that, we try to look at the gender part. So I want to say the research is young when you're looking at gender in agriculture, and needs to be nurtured and nourished. I think that's very important as we move forward. Often the work on gender in agriculture is often still very emotive. A lot of people have opinions, have thoughts, but there's very little data out there still, even after so many years. And often what's happened in the past is that a lot of these studies have been dominated by the social sciences. And I do appreciate that in a lot of cases, people call social science, they include economics, but I want to talk, in this case, often a lot of the gender work has often been more from an anthropologist, a sociologist side, which has its own implications. And that's often meant that it's quite often ad hoc and anecdotal, or at least it's seen that way. And so I think those are things that we do need to understand when we talk about gender in agricultural research as we move forward. It's also often been very descriptive. We've not been very analytical at times. We often describe, well, women are victims, but we don't take it the next level. What do we actually do about it? Or, as was mentioned by Ranjita, actually provide solutions. So I'm here also to plead that we move those things forward, but also to tell you that this is one of those things and one of those areas that we as Gender Platform do try to work on and try to move forward. And we are one of the few that have a whole group of gender researchers. We're up to about 92 gender researchers who are embedded very clearly within very technical areas. I myself, for one, I've worked a lot on livestock, so I'm probably one of the few gender people who actually knows about vaccines for livestock and can have discussions with people who are developing the vaccines and actually talk to them very clearly about why gender is important even in the vaccine. And that starts already by identifying which animal diseases we're looking at. Are we looking at cattle diseases? That's often more seen as male oriented, whereas if we're looking at sheep, we're already helping women if we develop a vaccine for sheep. So what I'm trying to say is that we are a group of international organizations that are have gender researchers, but are embedded across these. So what we then did is we developed what we call the platform, where we bring all these people together and where we try to synthesize, leverage, and develop a coherent but multidimensional agenda for gender research within agriculture and food systems. And we do this through three very interesting areas of work. Evidence, where we try to find rigorous and comparable evidence that we can actually have an impact, but also have data and knowledge gaps. So how can we actually fill those? But we also believe that as this is a young area of work, we need methods. We don't have that many methods that allow us for robust research when you look at gender. And that goes back a little bit to the fact that a lot of it has been anecdotal, has been ad hoc, has been, added on, and has never been very strong. Now, one of the ones that we do have in our back pocket, and that some of you might have heard of, is the Women Empowerment Agriculture Index, the WEA. And this is one that has been used across about 50 countries and actually starts developing the bigger story about what is gender in agriculture and how does it work. But we also try to do here is develop cutting edge methods so that we can also support the wider environment on the wider ecosystem on agriculture and gender. The last one is alliances, and that's where I hope that part of this conversation will also be about how can we build alliances with people in the room and on the panel to build a stronger and relevant agenda. We don't want to do an agenda, and that goes back to the comment Ranjita made about let's find solutions. We don't want to go off on our own and do research on something that's interesting, because we are researchers in the end, but we also want something that people can actually use as they move forward. So that's very important to us as well. And this is also where we build capacity, because having a good gender conversation means that people need to understand some of the basics on gender, even if they're not gender experts, just so that we can actually have a conversation that allows us to move forward. So this is sort of what the platform does. And here are some of the issues and some of the things we actually implement and actually have. Now, one very important part is a resource hub. We're trying to bring everything in gender in agriculture, mainly done by the CG, but also by our partners, together in one place. So again, that we don't have people reinventing the wheel, so that we don't have somebody who gets very excited about gender in agriculture and starts doing another study on adoption of a certain crop or so. It should be already in that resource hub. We've also done an evidence gap mapping to see where is the evidence and where are some of the gaps that we need to look at when we're looking at gender in agriculture. The other thing we're trying to do is bring out synthesis and systematic reviews on some of these issues of gender in agriculture and findings as solutions. And as well, we have an annual gender conference where we want to promote and show the younger people as well that, you know, doing gender in agriculture is actually interesting and important, and the research is worthwhile. So this is just to give you a little bit of background how we're trying to move that agenda forward by bringing together all the expertise and bringing all together the research. Because like I say, it's a very young science in and of itself. Now, this is my last one because I want to give a lot of space to the panel members. I did want to talk a little bit about climate change and then 2 entry points that I think are important where we still have a lot of research gaps. So first of all, climate change. This is opening up a lot of discussion and also hopefully some space to change the way we do things. We are all understanding that climate change is at our doorstep and that it is transforming our food system. And remember, agriculture is our most intimate relationship with nature and with climate change. So agriculture is going to be hit the most. So we don't have much time to actually solve these things. And so we need to start asking different research questions on that. And one of them is, we always seem to ask a research question that that has the conclusion that women are victims of climate change. Let's change those research questions and actually look at where women can be agents of change and how they can help with solving this. And so for me, one of the big one is, how can we actually get technologies and options into the hands, the best one for women, so that they can actually help with climate change through climate smart agriculture, whatever is needed, better policies, etc. So that's one area. Then there's 2 other areas that I've always been interested in and that I don't see a lot of discussion on. And one is time. For women, time is important. And we often talk about time poverty, but again, it's the negative side. Can't we see time as an asset? We talk about women not having assets like access to water, access to land. But what about this time? That's an asset they have. How can we make it be used much more efficient and effective? And let women decide how they want to use it. And in that process, understand what they need to make those decisions on how they use their time. And also the commodification of time. We talk a lot, and you'll see one of the presentation also talks about, is the burden of care. How does that fit in that whole commodification discussion? Then the last one I do want to talk about more is also labor and returns to labor. One of the things we are noticing, and a lot of the research we do in the CGIAR, is that women often don't get the right returns to labor. Look at livestock. Women do a lot of the work, but in the end, often, especially with larger animals, the animal gets sold by the husband. Do the women get anything back? So things like that, we do need to understand better and as we move forward. And then of course, the quality of labor. A lot of the technologies have not been built with women in mind. We still assume women are free labor, so let's go let them weed. Why? Why can't we do something better for them and develop the right technologies for them in that space? So these are just some quick thoughts from my side to open the discussion, but also to let the presenters provide their own views as we move forward on these things. I do think this is a time to act. We have climate change. We need to change things. Let's figure out how we can do that well, looking at those gender issues. So thanks again, Ranjita, for giving us the opportunity to present some of our work. And I hope to engage with more people in the room and online. So thanks again.
Thanks, Nicolene. Thanks for setting the context beautifully. And please hold any questions you might have for Nicolene until we get to the Q&A session at the end. And you might actually want to write them down, if possible, along with your email. In case we are not able to address all the questions right here in this session today, we will definitely respond by email. So moving on to the next, we now have Mrs. Sitambile Ndema, who's the Director of Policy Research and Analysis at the Food, Agriculture and Natural Resources Policy Analysis Network, FANDRPAN, and the Regional Policy Officer for the GCRF AfriCap program. All the acronyms are expanded in the bios. So Tembi focuses on enhancing the research to policy interface between climate change, smallholder agriculture, and poverty reduction by addressing the specific needs of vulnerable groups in Africa. She also serves as a co-chair of the Southern African Development Community, SADC, the thematic group there on climate change and disaster risk reduction. She is a member of the Farming First Steering Committee. She's also an advisor to the GFEI, Global Food and Environment Institute, African Science for Weather Information and Forecasting Techniques. She wears quite a few hats, actually. Over to you, Tembi, for sharing your perspectives on challenges confronting youth, rural youth, and the associated research and policy priorities. Over to you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm just trying to share my screen here. Please let me know once it comes up.
Yeah, you might want to put it on the slideshow mode, Tembi. Seeing your notes pages now as well.
Okay. Oh, okay. Let's see.
Yep.
Is this any better?
It's good. Yeah, just go to slideshow. Yeah. Still seeing
Still not. Okay, I'm not sure what's going on here, but let me try it one last time. My apologies. I tested this and it worked fine. Is this okay? Okay. No notes, I hope.
Very good. Go ahead, please.
All right. Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, depending on where you are joining us in the world. I guess everyone in the room, it's good afternoon. I heard you have just had a good lunch. I am sitting here in Pretoria, South Africa, and it's a beautiful sunny morning today. I work for the Food, Agriculture, Natural Resources Policy Analysis Network, FANAPAN, as I'm sure you'll see in the bio. But I wanted to share just a little bit so that you have a context of where I am coming from. So FANAPAN is a multi-stakeholder and multinational policy network. Our work supports the development and implementation of better food, agriculture, and natural resources policies in Africa. So today my presentation will focus on challenges confronting the rural youth in the Global South, with a focus on research and policy priorities for expanding demand and remunerative employment and livelihood opportunities for them. As I begin, I want first to just paint a picture of who are we talking about, right? Before I get into the research and policy priorities. So the global population of young people aged between 15 to 24 is more than 1.2 billion. Their numbers are, of course, declining in developed regions, but they're increasing in the developing world. Approximately 87% of the world's youth population lives in developing countries, and the majority of youth live in rural areas in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Central and Southeast Asia. So you'll find that in my presentation, I will have a strong leaning on sub-Saharan Africa, mostly because that's where my expertise and experience lies. But in most cases, the challenges and experiences of youth in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Central and Southeast Asia are quite similar. The productive roles of young rural people have an important consequence for development. I guess that's why we are discussing this now. I think it's particularly important, especially in a world that is expected to reach 9 billion by 2050. And the demand for agricultural products is also projected to increase by about 60%. So for rural youth, agriculture is still very much a primary source of employment, though mainly informal. In sub-Saharan Africa alone, over the next 5 years, it is expected that most youth will work on family farms and in household businesses. Only 1 in 4 will find wage employment, and a fraction of those jobs will be in the formal economy. So that is why it's vital to support rural youth in undertaking viable livelihood strategies. And I think I have to also point out as I begin my presentation that although rural youth face extra challenges and additional layers of exclusion compared to other youth, they are nevertheless finding their way to being the change they want to see in the world. So they are not just sitting, waiting to be beneficiaries, but some of them are already starting to take the reins and lead the way in as far as development is concerned. So to discuss some perhaps challenges that are unique to the rural youth population, we find that young people face many of the same challenges that are experienced by the broader rural population. The challenging economics of smallholder farming and agricultural value chains. Also, there's relatively underdeveloped rural markets and services economies. Limited financial resources are also available for entrepreneurship and investment. And also there's limited market access opportunities. And often there's a weak enabling environment. The policies are not conducive enough for young people to be able to engage fully within the rural economy. However, they also face additional challenges and service requirements that policymakers, researchers, and development practitioners must address. Some of these challenges I'm highlighting here in this presentation: issues of mobility, urban migration, assets, family of origin, and gender. Maybe just to highlight 1 or 2 of these unique challenges, I think in terms of urban migration, there tends to be a high level of mobility that is associated with higher levels of urban migration, driven at least in part by perceived and actual limited opportunities for employment in rural areas. A study that was done by IFAD in 2020 found that in 2019, rural youth are 40% more likely than old adults to migrate to urban areas. So there's always this sort of pull or attraction that life is better in the urban areas, and young people then move from the rural areas to the urban areas in search of a better life, in search of employment opportunities. Then in terms of family of origin, maybe that might be interesting, and I might just need to elaborate on that. So often the familial starting point of has a very strong impact on their livelihoods trajectories. So in terms of what's the family situation that they're brought up in, a study as well that was done by IFAD found that youth born into farming households are most likely to end up being employed in farming, while the opposite holds true into non-farming households. So these are some of the sort of circumstances that shape the decisions that young people end up making, or that sort of shape the paths that young people. I wanted to show this rural transition pathways model because I believe there is something in here that perhaps can be used to help young people transition. This model that you're seeing in your screen, I hope it's clear enough. It sort of describes a series of predictable development trajectories for smallholder households as they pursue resilience and urgency through various livelihood strategies. And I think this is also, it holds very true for young people as well. So these transition pathways coalesce around 4 centers of gravity, which are like your broad categories of livelihoods that rural households may choose to engage in. So the first one is farming as a business. I think for us in Africa here, it is usually an assumed thing that if you live in the rural areas, you are a farmer. But that's not necessarily true for everybody. I think it's just an assumption that a lot of people have. So smallholder households remain in primary production if we're looking at farming as a business. And a smallholder household invests in growing its farming business, it may move from subsistence to more intensified or commercialized farming. So there is a sort of growth pathway within farming, within the farming area, where they are moving from being primary producers for livelihood purposes, all the way up to being commercial farmers going into production, mostly to make a living and an income out of that. Then there's rural services entrepreneurship. Some smallholder households may shift away from primary agricultural production, pursuing maybe entrepreneurship-based livelihood strategies. They may focus on agricultural services such as input distribution, maybe veterinary services, processing or aggregation, or they can completely take a different path and go into non-agricultural services like transportation, running a local shop. Where I come from, there's been a lot of mushrooming of business centers where people can have access to phones, where they can have access to computers, and maybe where they can do photocopying and that sort of thing. So some people are really going big into shops like that, or of course shops where they sell goods and other products that are not necessarily agriculture related. Then when you're looking at rural labor component, households may remain in the rural areas, but focus their livelihood strategies on employment that supports the activities of large commercial farms or small to medium enterprises. So this labor may be agricultural or non-agricultural, and it can be formal or non-formal. And finally, when looking at urban migration, I think here we are looking at facing enough push and pull factors where rural households may migrate to an urban area and transition to a completely non-agricultural type of livelihood. So I think this sort of pathway model can help researchers and policymakers determine the right interventions at the right time for the rural youth population. But given the unique position of youth in the rural economy, researchers and policies may want to sort of layer on an understanding of specific needs and challenges. And at a foundational level, young people have the same sort of rural transition pathway options as older people. But based on their unique life stages, skills, networks, and assets, youth have different needs, opportunities, and challenges that may lead them to transition differently through the rural pathways model. So it might not be as straight forward, maybe moving from this stage 1 to stage 7, or going through stage 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 7. So it could take different trajectories. Then in order to create opportunities for the youth, I think the research community as well as policymakers, they need to match the demographic changes and challenges faced by the youth based on the pathway transitioning that they are pursuing. Here I have 7 pathways that can be used to address youth challenges. So for instance, in pathway 1, we are looking at targeting youth who are still very much in subsistence farming households. And here we should be looking at providing products and services that sort of meet the broader needs of these households. So this may include non-agricultural needs such as finance products, maybe input financing, and also subsidies and agronomic training. And here there's also a recognition that youth are some of the first adopters of innovative practices and technologies and development interventions. So they can also be the drivers of sort of professionalizing, maybe if I can put it that way, farming, or sort of making farming more attractive as a sector. We have some good examples of this happening already. In Uganda, for instance, SNV is training young model farmers to demonstrate the potential of farming as a business, and they are providing valuable lessons to their peers. So one thing that I always speak about is that the youth want to have role models. So when, for instance, when looking at soccer, they would look at people like Lionel Messi and, you know, Cristiano Ronaldo and want to emulate those people. But within the agriculture sector, we don't have those role models that young people can emulate. So I think looking at this first pathway and the example of the work that's happening in Uganda, they are trying to provide those role models for young people in agriculture who can be their inspiration and can teach them some valuable lessons. So for pathways 2, I'm not going to go through each pathways, but just giving examples. So for pathways 2 and 3, this is where emerging youth farmers can actively seek out growth opportunities to improve their family farms, where a number of service adaptation approaches may be used. Here, youth will probably need tailored financial products to allow them to purchase or lease land, as well as access to more sort of complex farming inputs and assets. This may be in the form of maybe microfinancing institutions that come in big time, or fintech players such as Farm Drive, who are targeting youth with adapted financial products. So there are quite a number of interesting, I think, interesting opportunities within pathways that young people can take. And maybe just looking at conversion to rural employment here quite quickly on pathway 6. Here for young people working in the areas, we are looking at securing consistent employment, which can be a big challenge due to a general lack of rural non-farm employment opportunities. And there are service providers that are starting to sort of partner with private sector to train youth in response to some of the demands that are coming there in Rwanda, and also here in South Africa. There are some good non-profit social enterprises like Harambe that are starting to do interesting work. So with that said, looking at the sort of different pathways that young people can take, I think there's still a lot of room for research to understand the needs of the young people and to match them to potential pathways and potential innovations that they can adopt. But on the policy side of things, I think I want to just end my presentation by looking on the policy side of things. The youth can be an important resource. Their voices can help shape policies and decisions for the future. There is need to enhance their role in policy processes by including their ideas and experiences. And young men and women are major driving forces for shaping a better future of work in the rural areas. So by listening to and actively engaging them, youth can be powerful agents to shift agri-food systems towards more sustainable patterns. Thank you.
Thembi, thank you very much. The pathways model, very interesting, demonstrating how there are other opportunities that can and need to be opened up. And being in the agriculture sector doesn't mean that you're only plowing and producing food. And also that not everybody, not every young person might be trying to get out of agriculture or move out of rural areas. So what can we do for them? And I think messages loud and clear from you and Nicolene about how women and youth can be agents of change in transforming rural areas and the agri-food systems. And another message that I am taking away, we need Ronaldos and Messis in the agriculture sector. And let's see if we can find those. Thank you. And audience, please hold your thoughts as we move to the next presenter. We'll now listen to Dr. Nozomi Kawarazuka, a colleague of mine in the CGIAR. She's a senior gender researcher and a social anthropologist at the International Potato Center, and she's based in Vietnam. And Nozomi is involved in interdisciplinary agricultural research on a very wide range of topics. And she focuses on political economy and political ecology from a gender perspective and explores the processes of exclusion and marginalization in formal and informal food systems. Her talk today will highlight the interplay between economic and non-economic activities of women and why it is important to value the non-economic activities as an essential component of livelihoods. Over to you, Nozomi. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranjita. Hi, everyone. Today I wanted to travel to India for this conference, but I couldn't make it for various reasons. I do research in India as well, especially in eastern and northeastern states. Today, I'm going to talk about women's unpaid care and domestic work and their implications for women's employment, empowerment, and livelihood. First, I will share the result of my research based in Vietnam and then discuss conceptual, theoretical, and practical implications. So first, I share the research result of how men and women spend their time. This was conducted in a village in northern Vietnam, but I have similar data from some other countries. Both women and men spend more than 8 hours in agriculture, but women spend 4 hours more on domestic work. Men's sleeping time is longer because this includes over drinking at night and sleeping until late morning or even afternoon sometime. Another key point is that women's agriculture work is considered as part of domestic work by both men and women themselves because they are mainly in charge of growing food crops, maintaining a home garden, and livestock rearing. This has many implications which I'm going to talk about. So next, I would like to share how far do women benefit from labor and time-saving technologies. This research was also conducted in the same location in Vietnam. We asked both men and women groups what are labor-saving technologies available for men and women. Men proudly shared agricultural equipment and machines. Women struggled to find them. They finally took photos of sewing machine, rice cooker that only 5 households in the village have, and water pipes which not many households have. And on the right photo, a message of this young woman. She says that she doesn't have any labor-saving equipment, and this manual work of cooking, animal feeding, takes time and labor every morning starting at 4 a.m. So key message here is that women's work, both agriculture and domestic activities, are not mechanized. I think this is because women's agriculture work belong to domestic activities, putting them as a secondary position, not important. Men help domestic work when it is mechanized like this gas cookers. I found it because when I did one village, men are more supporting, spending time on cooking. So I was wondering why, and I realized that village already have gas cooker. If firewood, men won't help. So also men take over specific agriculture tasks when they are mechanized, such as weeding. If manual, it's women's job, but if mechanized, it's men's job. So next, how is women's domestic work conceptualized in current capitalist economy, which is a main stream for all over the world? Please look at the figure on the right. Capitalist systems look at relationships between labor, capital, and market. Actually, economic activities, these capitalist systems depend on non-economic elements such as natural resources, women's labor for child care, and food preparation. But they remain invisible, underground, and unrecognized as if they are free for forever, every time free. So therefore, those non-economic aspects are neglected from economic account of how capitalist systems work, both conceptually, methodologically, and also practically. This is a contradiction of capitalism. So this ideology allows the capitalist economy to create multiple hierarchies in research disciplines, the society, and even within the household. Hierarchy in research discipline means that research analyzing non-economic activities are less valued. In the society and the household, people who engage in care and domestic work are less valued. The most important thing to mention here is that this is highly gendered. It is mostly women who do research on domestic work and who engage in non-economic activities. So how do non-economic activities, domestic work, influence women's economic activities? I need to emphasize that women, young women including, are also engaging in economic activities, but they cannot forget about their families. While men can separate their economic activities without worrying about domestic and care work. This is a big difference. So especially poor women access their informal jobs via family connections. Women also access financial resources and productive assets via their husband. They therefore have to be a good wife and good daughter-in-law and a good sister-in-law. Otherwise, their economic activities can be threatened. So in this respect, non-economic activities, which means family relations, are equally important for women to sustain economic activities. This makes big difference in women's business compared to men's business. So what are implications of devaluing women's domestic work for women's economic empowerment discourse? Women's economic empowerment discourse often only cares about women's economic activities. By so doing, the discourse itself contributes to devaluing domestic work and care. Who will then do domestic work and care? Can we keep ignoring them? I would say that current women's empowerment should not be simply involving more women in market-oriented agriculture systems. So policy change and system changes are required for addressing the problem of domestic work and care as a public issue of gender. Please remember that for rural poor women, non-economic activities include agriculture, and they are all manual, including domestic work, fetching water, fetching firewood. So what are implications for devaluing women's domestic work for crisis? So the last, my topic is a crisis. The process in which women are affected by COVID and other crises, such as climate change, is very complicated because their non-economic activities are also affected by the crisis, as well as their economic activities. In the global north, currently child care was highlighted as the impact of COVID. But in the global south, it is far more than the issue of child care. So the key message here is that without addressing social provisioning for the poor, especially for women, agriculture development alone cannot make agriculture resilient to ongoing overlapping crisis. I would propose that transdisciplinary approaches to research and development are required to understand the underground part that is also socially valuable and important. So in conclusion, root causes of poverty and gender inequality are hidden in underground, which is social and political. We often try to solve this issue by economic activities of women. How can we change dominant discourses and increase value of research on domestic work and care, which are subordinated by research on economics and business? How can we incorporate women's experiences into the post-COVID development planning in agri-food systems that I would discuss with the panelists? This is very important. Okay, thank you, Ranjita. Finished.
Yes. So much, Nozomi. Wow, that was lots of food for thought there. I don't think I even want to summarize any of that, just that it's an example from Vietnam, but I can only say how true that rings for a lot of developing countries, Asia, Africa. So thank you so much for putting that out to all of us here. Moving on to the next, as I said, sorry, but let's hold on to the questions. Moving on, we now have Professor Priya Deshinkar, who's a very well-known name for folks who are working on migration, an internationally renowned expert on internal migration and precarious work. And she has extensively worked in South and Southeast Asia, as well as Africa. And she focuses on forced labor, precarity, and human agency in labor migration. She has advised the Indian Ministry of Urban Affairs on policies related to circular migration, and her work has influenced the draft Indian National Migration Policy. She's played a key role in decolonizing the teaching curriculum on migration and development at the University of Sussex. Very honored to have you here, Priya. Over to you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much for that warm welcome. And can I just say at the beginning that I really enjoyed listening to all the presentations before that came before me, and I've learned a lot, and it's very encouraging to hear the direction in which the thinking is going. So without further ado, I'd like to share my slide because I was told that I don't have more than 10 minutes. So I'll try to pack it all in that time. 1 second. I think you should be able to see that now. I'll go in slide mode. Can you see that? Yeah. Ranjita, can you see it?
Yeah, looks good, Priya. Yeah, sorry.
Okay. All right, so I'm very happy to be here today. I will talk about circular migration. And by circular migration, I mean people who move between rural and urban areas, because I feel that that kind of migration is very relevant to the discussion that we're having today. And I'll talk about the opportunities that migration offers and the vulnerabilities that it creates, and also ways forward. And I'm happy to say that my points are very much in sync with the points that have been made by previous speakers. So just a quick roadmap here. So my focus is very much on men, women, and youth working in low-paid, precarious jobs at destination. These are the so-called dirty jobs, and they're often taken up by circular migrants for a variety of social and economic reasons. Then I'll go on to processes of exclusion, which are historical and othering of certain groups of people, and the links to migration. I'll talk about the vulnerability of circular migrants. I mean, I'll go through all of these points very quickly and then move on to my main points. Something on climate change and the shifts in agriculture and migration. and mainly the importance of moving away from a household model of migration and rational economic analysis to incorporate aspirations and intra-household dynamics. I'll say a little bit about the impacts of COVID on migration and future directions for research and policy. So let's look at what happens at origin. I mean, most of you know all of this, but just to quickly recap, there are historical patterns of material and social exclusion, which have resulted in marginal landholdings or landlessness. People in such arrangements are often trapped in relations of labor extraction, indebtedness, and humiliation, which is a very important thing, with upper castes and landlords. There's a lack of dignity in the way that they work, which is continuously reproduced through practices of discrimination, stigmatization, and othering. Change has taken place due to education, etc., but backlashes against those who dare to move beyond their station are common. So remuneration for manual work is extremely poor, even in non-farm work, and that's quite important again. Practices are followed to reinforce subjugation in relations of power, such as late payment, part payment, non-remunerated work outside the job, and the act of payment itself. So, you know, it's not just a clinical arrangement, you do the work and you get paid. There's a whole other set of behavioral practices that come in to reinforce those power relations. And migration is seen as a way of renegotiating caste boundaries symbolically and materially. So, you know, this is like an escape from these kinds of power relations. I mean, of course, it's not ideal, as I'm just going to explain. So it's a little bit like out of the frying pan into the fire, because, you know, even when migrants work in urban areas, they're very vulnerable because they work in low paid, unskilled or semi-skilled work. And I'm talking about the bottom tier of labor migrants here, because that's very much where my own interest is. And they work in precarious, dangerous employment arrangements, and it's endemic in these kinds of circular migrants. In India, vulnerability arises from neoliberal work regimes and the exclusion of migrants belonging to marginalized communities from welfare programs. Now, this is very well documented, although huge progress has been made to bring such migrants under the many protective schemes and laws such as the Interstate Migrant Workmen Act, the Building and Other Construction Workers Act, or minimum wage regulation. There are still large parts of the labor force at the bottom tier of industries and services who are unable to claim welfare benefits and state protection. So the overall picture is that short-term or circular migration is from rural areas to urban and peri-urban locations where they work in industries and services. The work may be in construction or the textile and garment industry, street vending, rickshaw pulling, or domestic work. And millions of people are involved in these kinds of occupations. I mean, I'm not going to get into the whole discussion on numbers here, but these flows are dominated by lower castes and other disadvantaged groups. They work mainly in the informal sector without proper contracts, security, or stability, and they may even be physically separated, so marginalized spatially in the city, in informal settlements, or living on site, even in the open. And they may not have citizenship rights due to a lack of identity document and registration under labor laws. So I mean, citizenship rights may be a bit strong, but what they can't prove is who they are and that they deserve benefits under welfare programs because they lack the documentation. So what's happened with climate change, agriculture, and migration? I mean, we all know that there's plenty of evidence to show that slow onset events can lead to short and long-term migration. Climate impacts on natural resource dependent livelihoods, especially agriculture, But what we don't have is a granular enough picture. We can't explain why some people stay and some people move, and the ways in which they migrate. So it's a highly varied picture, and even recent efforts to synthesize all the available evidence show that there's not one single model here. There are multiple ways in which climate acts on migration and agriculture, and it's very difficult to generalize. So one issue here, which I want to highlight as a migration expert, is that these models tend to simplify and assume causality. So they don't examine the role of politics and governance of natural resources and how this might lead to migration and displacement. So for example, encroachment of land or land grabs, large development projects. They look at forced and economic migration, but very little recognition of aspirations and social becoming through migration, which I'm going to dwell on a bit in a later slide. They assume that the household is a unified entity, so they don't really examine the differences between the generations and gender differences between men and women, or female and male, young people and youth. So the young may want to migrate away from agriculture, for example, and we've heard that being mentioned already this morning, because they don't want a future in agriculture. And I've heard this time and time again, not just in India, but also in many other settings across the world. Also, these models assume that the ability to migrate depends on access to resources. There's a need for qualifying that statement as well. And I've done quite a lot of work on the so-called migration industry, or the network of brokers and intermediaries who make migration possible. I mean, they're often painted in a very negative light, but these may be the people who are instrumental in helping people dependent on agriculture get out of those areas and explore other possibilities and take advantage of development in other locations. So these are the kinds of issues that I feel we need to unpick when we think about climate change, agriculture, and migration. So let's go to youth migration. And, as we heard, this is quite a major issue of discussion now. I feel there's a need to understand how migration decisions are shaped by intra-family negotiations around gender roles, the life course, and education and work. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, there's this assumption that the family operates as a kind of unified unit, and there's no conflict within that in relation to migration decisions. There is a lot of conflict, or a lot of differences, which may or may not become open conflicts, but there's certainly a lot of negotiation around who should migrate at what point in their life course, when women should migrate and when men should migrate, and when young women and men should migrate. So the parental expectations of sons and daughters could be quite different from young people's own aspirations for their future. So, the parents might want the son to stay behind and manage the farm, or they may support the migration decision if the son agrees to send money back home that can be invested in family projects. Similarly with daughters, there may be restrictions also related to marriage and other, milestones in their life course. So those decisions and those expectations can be quite different from the parental side, whereas for young people, it may be completely different. Now, they may offer family reasons as the primary motivation for migrating. So when you talk to them, they may say, yeah, I migrated to support my parents or to earn money for this, that, and the other. But all of those are, all those reasons are entangled with their personal aspirations as well, which is something we need to recognize more, and we need to actually research more. I hate to say, I know that I'm a researcher, and although it might be said that we don't need more research, we do actually need more research on certain aspects of this whole equation. So it's not uncommon to hear migrants saying that they're migrating to send money home, but we don't know enough about their visions for self-development. You know, what they see happening through migration in the longer term. And I emphasize long term here because that is something, again, that's underemphasized in the discussion. So young people don't necessarily see themselves as eking out an existence through rain-fed farming with all of its risks, which are growing with climate change. They want to become a part of the globalized economy and society. They want to become modern in the way that they work. They want to acquire new skills and urban lifestyles. And migration offers all of these things, of course, with a cost. I mean, it's not a bed of roses because they go to exploitative jobs in the city. And I started off by saying how they're very precarious, working in low-paid jobs, etc. But those exploitative jobs are often seen as a stepping stone to something else. And this is why I emphasize the long-term aspect of this. It's not a one single point in time. You know, they are entering exploitative jobs. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But they see them as opening up possibilities because in urban areas, there are multiple possibilities. They switch jobs all the time. They can go up informal job ladders through skill acquisition or changing jobs. And that's how they're viewing that employment. It's not an end in itself. And for young women, it also brings the added advantage of breaking away from preordained life trajectories of marriage and childbearing and subservience to in-laws. Again, you know, this is something that so many young women have expressed to me, and I've heard it through other people's research reports as well. That they want to break away from that, you know, and migration offers them that opportunity. I mean, they may have restrictions on working back in the village because of the religion or caste reasons. They may have restrictions because they're expected to perform certain roles and get married at a certain age and have children, etc. So it's very important now for younger women who aspire to a different lifestyle. And I think we really need to take a gender disaggregated view on this. We can't lump youth under the same category. So in other words, migration isn't just about coping and survival or about the economics of migration. It's much, much more than that. And I think we need to start looking at that. So what happened when COVID hit? Again, the story is very well known in the Indian context. Millions who were working in industry, domestic work, food production, transport networks were suddenly out of work because they weren't employed with formal contracts and their employers weren't legally obliged to keep them on when the lockdown happened. You know, before the lockdown, they were content with these informal arrangements because they was earning significant amounts of money compared to what they could earn at home and remitting significant amounts of money. But then all of a sudden, their precarity was exposed because the money stopped and there was no support from anywhere. Many had to walk hundreds of miles back to their villages. We've heard the harrowing details, which are now well known. And they were unable to access welfare and social protection provisions. The reasons for that were not very well understood at the time, but since then, quite a bit of thinking has been done, both at the policy level and, you know, there's many, many more organizations on the ground also working on this issue. So it's a very different world now, 2 years out, but still this work, you know, the precarity of the work that they do remains. So what happened after COVID was that initially, you know, when migrants started going back, it was male dominated because of the uncertainty. I mean, it was a huge shock. And, you know, they did not want to set foot back in those cities, especially with their families. So women did stay behind. They, of course, fulfilled an important social reproduction function. And, you know, that was an important safety net for these migrants when they came back home after being stranded in the city. But now what they're talking about is diversifying to other locations and occupations, but they're unlikely still to return to agriculture. I mean, the idea that this kind of uncertainty and shock would then make them think of agriculture as an option, unfortunately hasn't materialized. And because the same old problems, and it's not just the lack of resources, I mean, there are all kinds of issues in rural areas which drove them out in the first place and sadly haven't changed much even now. And again, it's especially true for young women who find rural society stifling due to gender norms and roles. I mean, I heard one woman saying to one of my colleagues that, you know, she said, well, hum to gaon mein baithe rehte hain, you know, I'm just expected to sit at home. I can't even do anything, you know, so she felt frustrated by that kind of arrangement. And so that kind of needs to be recognized as well. So ways forward for research and policy. I feel that just improving adaptive capacity in agriculture or generally trying to make it more attractive may not have the desired impact on controlling distress migration or whatever you want to call it. Because it's not just a question of a lack of resources that is driving people out. They're taking on this work in cities, even though it's not decent work, but because it's seen as a stepping stone. And we really need to recognize that long-term perspective they're taking. We need to support people in their decisions to reduce the risks and costs of migration and create a win-win situation for migrants as well as agriculture without trapping them in agriculture. So they all speak fondly of agriculture and they would like to see it flourishing, but at the same time, they don't want to be denied opportunities for exploring urban areas and taking life trajectories of their own choosing. So I think that's very much, you know, we need to recognize that they don't see themselves as static people trapped in agriculture or in rural areas. They want to move around, they're mobile, you know, they've got a different outlook on life. And we need to sort of think of ways of making it a win-win situation for migration and agriculture. And just a little bit about agency here, because, you know, someone mentioned, I think Nicolene said that we can't view women as victims. And I would very much underline that. We can't view women or indeed men who are going into these precarious jobs as victims. They're very much agents of change for their own life. They are in precarious jobs that are informal, unreliable, low paid, etc., etc. But can their everyday acts of coping, navigating, and negotiating these structures of oppression in urban areas be called strategies for change? And some have argued they can't because they're merely coping and they never, you know, change the balance of power. But like I've said, I take a different stance on this. And I think that they're taking calculated decisions. They're not victims, they're agents of change because they're trying to make a difference in their own lives. And we do need to recognize that. So I feel that in order to fully appreciate that, we need to incorporate time and translocal connections into our analysis. So my approach to understanding the role of aspirations and agency in migration is to incorporate both the translocality and temporality approach into the analysis, because their acts must be understood both in relation to their connections with their families back at home and also their own long-term visions for self-development. And I've studied precarious migrant jobs in a variety of contexts in India and other countries in the global south, as Ranjita mentioned, to show that although these jobs are extremely problematic in terms of the levels of exploitation, they may represent the only real possibility for breaking away from grinding rural poverty and life trajectories that they don't want. They do invest back in rural areas. They do invest in agriculture as well, which is again something that needs to be emphasized. You know, quite often their remittances are used to lease in land or improve whatever farming technologies they're using. So there's definitely a positive feedback loop there that needs greater recognition as well. So thank you very much for listening to me. There's 2 papers I've listed here where I address some of these issues that you might find interesting. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Priya. Thanks for the great insights and the guidance on how to approach this issue as we design programs and policies. Yes, I think there is still a lot more research that needs to be done to understand this. And thanks for highlighting that migration is not an event, but it's a complex process, and we need to take a long-term perspective of that. And it isn't just an economic decision. It isn't just an individual decision. And that youth is not a homogeneous group. One size, one solution doesn't fit everyone. Thank you so much. And over to the last presentation in this series today, last but not the least, we have Dr. Cher Verick, who's head of the Employment Strategies Unit in the Employment, Labor Market and Youth Branch in the ILO Geneva. And prior to this, he held positions with ILO in Turin and New Delhi. He's also worked for the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa and various research institutions in Europe and Australia. He is a very familiar name, I think, for this group who works on labor economics and for the Indian Society of Labor Economics. He's published very widely on this topic. Cher, welcome to share your perspectives on structural transformation and what that means for women's labor force participation and employment. Over to you. Thank you so much.
Right. Thanks a lot, Ranjita, and a big thanks to ISLE, CGIAR, and IRRI for this opportunity. It's a shame that I can't be there with you. I've been to so many of the ISLEs, but I'm afraid with the hybrid format that's working so well, it will become even harder to travel, but hopefully next time I'll be there in person. This has been an extremely interesting discussion, and there's been a lot of overlap on certain issues that I will touch on. As Ranjita pointed out, I wanted to take a broader perspective on women's participation in the labor market, particularly in the context of rural areas and its relationship with agriculture. As also mentioned, the COVID-19 crisis has reminded us of some of the key gendered aspects of labor markets and how crises expose and exacerbate the disparities. Just to mention before going into the meat of my presentation, as also pointed out, COVID-19 crisis has hit women harder, but in particular young women, as Priya pointed out, we really need to look at youth, not as an homogenous group. They suffered a much greater decline, especially in middle-income countries like India. And that reflects both the sectoral nature of their employment, that is, they were in sectors that were hit harder, but also the constraint of care responsibilities and other factors. So I think it's really important to see ultimately the interlinkage between paid economic activity and unpaid economic activity. And that is, also a reference to Nozomi's very interesting presentation. And, really would stress it's really about those leakages that matter as well. So I want to just come back to an issue that is also very familiar to ISLE and to many of you sitting there. So I know it's not a new topic, of course, the issue of women's participation in the labor force, particularly in rural areas, and to see that within the context of structural transformation. There's been, a long debate about women's paid work versus unpaid work. And I just would stress at this point, I am talking about paid employment outside the home because of its important linkage with the process of development and structural transformation. So it's ultimately about the access to non-farm rural employment, has already been flagged by previous speakers. So, but at the same time, in light of what Nozomi said, I would stress it's also about the linkage between the unpaid and the paid economic activity. These are not isolated phenomenon. In particular, we have good evidence that unpaid economic activity acts as a constraint for women to be able to participate in paid economic activity outside the home. And the line that I've tried to take over the years on this topic is that we should ultimately focus on whether women are able to access decent and productive employment, not just any job. So, these issues of precarity highlighted by Priya and others is critical. And in the end, it is about choice, as also mentioned by Priya, not about, one or the other, but what we see really in reality, the impact of restriction on whether women stay at home or have opportunities to find employment that is not menial, that is not backbreaking, either in agriculture or in a factory. So I think choice is an absolutely critical issue that needs to be considered. But I do want to take that step back to see it from that broader macroeconomic perspective, because at the end of the day, the more productive and diversified an economy is, also geographically, the greater the opportunity to access decent jobs. However, those constraints that prevent women from doing so acts as a major hurdle for countries to develop and to reach their growth potential. But at the same time, I would concur with also the points made, including by Priya, that it's not going from rural Bihar to Denmark in one go. Of course, there are different pathways, and I had that word already highlighted even before hearing Tembi's presentation. So I very much concur with this view of pathways. So, there are different pathways and stepping stones to lead to, to an outcome of development. And as you all know, the stylized development process has been characterized by a movement of resources from low productivity sectors, agriculture, to high productivity sectors in manufacturing, etc. And, for a long time, manufacturing has been seen as a driver of development. Of course, that's Calder's perspective of growth, etc. Traditionally, of course, then industrialization spurred urbanization. And this is, which drove the population to urban areas. And of course, Tembi pointed out this as well about how youth move. I don't need to go over those issues again. But as you also know, there's this very complex relationship between women's participation in the labor force and the development process. As, I know a lot of you are familiar with that topic itself. Of course, going back to Golden and Bursrup before, this idea that there's a U-shaped hypothesis between participation in the labor force and development. It's high at low levels of development because women are mostly participating in agriculture. It declines through this as this process of structural transformation takes place. And as the services sector emerges, then women return. Now, that's a very stylized hypothesis. And in fact, there's little evidence to suggest that is the case in many countries, including in India. And as all of you know, and India and other countries in South Asia have been a real puzzle in this respect, right? India experienced from a low rate. And of course, the whole issue of measurement is fully acknowledged. I mean, there's an issue of measurement of labor force participation of women because of unpaid activities and all those issues that are there with the collection of that data through surveys. But that said, there has, India's participation has been low, but even declined over the 2000s, especially in rural areas. And this is going back a little bit in time for me. And of course, for many of you have looked at these issues since over the last 10 years. But, when I was in India, we looked at, these factors and worked heavily on this topic, trying to make it a much more prominent policy issue, which I think has become. But we looked at that time also at some of those reasons behind declining participation. And as you know, they included increased education enrollment, income effect, though that can be very much debated, issues around measurement has already flagged, but ultimately the lack of job opportunities, particularly in rural areas. And one aspect that I had seen anecdotally, I had seen myself on field visits to East UP, for example, was the impact of mechanization of agriculture. And I didn't have that empirical evidence at the time, but I see more recently some very well-known economists, and they may well be at the ISLE this year, from Afridi, Bishnu and Marjan, have looked at actually the relationship between the mechanization in Indian agriculture and the reduction in farm employment in rural areas, particularly for women. And they actually find that of the 32 percentage point increase in mechanization during a period from 1999 to 2011 accounted for a vast majority of the decline in women's rural employment in agriculture. So this is first time I've seen some figures on a phenomenon that I had seen anecdotally, and it's a very important one, because when we come to what we see in the data now, and this is something I'm also posing for discussion, because I'm not working so heavily on the current data, so it'd be very interesting to hear what people have on this, is that you see that, you know, participation rates, particularly in rural areas, continue to decline until 2018, increased slightly in 2019, but there was a big increase in 2020, and this whole issue of distress migration has been flagged already and highlighted by Priya. But you see women's participation in rural areas going up from 22.7% in 2019 to 28.2% in 2020. So, you know, if you would take this at face value, you would say, oh, India's turning the corner on women's participation, but no, clearly it's much more due to the impact of COVID, right? And as pointed out, thousands and millions of people had to go back into rural areas during COVID, particularly during those harsh lockdowns in 2020. And when you look at actually the data, I was just going through the data that the ILO has from the PLFS, and then you can see quite clearly that increase in participation in rural areas was driven by women's increased employment in agriculture. So in fact, the share of women working in agriculture in India, but also the absolute numbers, increased significantly from 2019 to 2020s. So the share nationally went up from 53.9% to 57.9%, but it went up from 60, and for rural areas, of course, where the majority of agriculture work is done, went up from 69.9% to 75%. So, you know, and if you look at the share of the increase in women's employment in agriculture, in the total increase in employment for women that from 2019 to 2020, it accounts for 75%. So meaning that there was an increase of 22.6 million increase in women's employment in 2020 relative to 2019. And of that, 16.9 million was in agriculture. But as you all know, and this is why it's very interesting to talk to experts on the agri-food systems, which I am clearly not, is to understand its implications for the nature of their work, because as everyone knows in this audience, the productivity of employment in agriculture has been declining for a long time. It accounts still, even before the COVID boost that I've just been describing, still accounted for a large share of workers in India, around 45% of total men and women, but less than 20% of GDP. And, you know, so now you have this big push increase again in agricultural employment, particularly among women, but at the same time, its contribution to output remains low. So there's a huge challenge in terms of the productivity employment, and then ultimately the remuneration returns to labor as been flagged by Nicolina and others. And so what I would just, you know, stress is that it's really important to look at this process of structural transformation and the creation of decent and productive employment outside agriculture, which is really not taking place in a significant way in India. It was a challenge years ago when I was personally involved in a lot of that research, and clearly it remains a challenge in India, given that, you know, the majority of people, when they have to go back in, find some sort of distress forms of work, they end up going back into agriculture. And I'm not saying working in agriculture is all bad. Indeed, it's critical. And we know we've neglected employment in agriculture as an important source of livelihood in many economic discourses. I fully acknowledge that. But at the same time, it does pose major challenges in terms of productivity and also the whole development process. So really, as you know, has been known for some time, but this is just reinforcing some of those key messages. You know, efforts are needed to ensure that there are more jobs outside the large metros, and you know, in the smaller towns, and to really support you know, the development and the creation of decent productive employment also in non-farm rural sectors. There are a bunch of policy areas that's needed for that. I don't have time to go in them, but I think, you know, some of those ones intrinsically linked to women's agency, to women's choice, are absolutely critical, including that work-family balance, access to childcare, etc., and overall ability to access jobs of better working conditions. So just in conclusion, you know, I think this is an area that, you know, though it's been heavily researched in recent years, what we see now with COVID adds a new dimension to it. So, really remains a critical area for research. This link between agriculture, non-farm employment, rural areas, this link between a non-paid and paid economic activity, and then really looking at transitions between these. This is the problem when you look at stocks. We look at net changes, but it's ultimately those flows that matter, really reflecting the ability to make choices about where and how women can work. And that really obviously requires an interdisciplinary approach to understand both the perspective of the labor market and the agri-food system. So I think there's a great opportunity to think about that further. So thanks a lot, Ranjita, back to you.
Thanks, Cher. Excellent. Thank you for almost summarizing the previous presentations extremely ably, and then highlighting the need for unpacking the structural transformation processes and the continuing issues of measurement, not just in India, but I think globally we have these issues. Thanks a lot. And I know you're on a holiday this week and you've still done this for us. Very grateful indeed. And so without much ado, let's move on to the next part of the session. We are running out of time fairly quickly. May I invite our two panelists to come on to the stage here. Absolute pleasure to have Dr. Vidya Vemireddy and Dr. Amrita Datta with me here. Dr. Bidisha Barua is joining us online. She went to the airport this morning in Delhi to discover that her flight was canceled, so she has to join online here. Very brief introductions. Vidya is an assistant professor at the Center for Management in Agriculture at IIM Ahmedabad, and she is a research affiliate with the Tata Cornell Institute for Agriculture and Nutrition. And she's been a very active partner for us at the CGIAR Gender Platform. She has a PhD in applied economics and management from Cornell, and she's been studying women's roles in agriculture, nutrition pathways, mechanization trends within agricultural adoption, and labor-saving technologies. And Bidisha, who's joining us virtually, is a lead specialist at the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, 3IE, as it is popularly known. And she has 10 years of experience leading research and evaluation projects on agricultural value chains, private sector, financial inclusion, with a focus on women's empowerment. And she leads 3IE's Swashakt evidence program, which is about studying women's economic empowerment. And she has a PhD in economics from the Delhi School of Economics. Welcome, Bidisha. And Amrita is an assistant professor of development studies at IIT Hyderabad. Her research interests are in the areas of migration, mobilities, agrarian change and rural development, women's work, gender and development. She's published very widely on these topics, and she has a PhD in development studies from IISS and Erasmus in the Netherlands, and MPhil from Cambridge. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for joining us. Is it okay if I just continue to stand here and we have this conversation? So a lot to digest, I guess, for all of us from these very, very rich presentations that we have heard so far. And one of the prerequisites that we realize we need for developing realistic strategies, solutions, as we were saying, to address the women and youth employment and livelihood challenges is having robust and relevant data and evidence. Many of these aspects that have been highlighted by the speakers, we do not have adequate, or so we think, we do not have enough evidence or sometimes methods or to even measurements even. How do we measure all these things? So therefore, a question to the panelists, do you think, I mean, that was our view, but do you actually think we have relevant data and evidence on women and youth, their participation in food systems, formal and informal sectors? And then considering, the point was made, youth are not a homogeneous group. Similarly, women are not a homogeneous group. Intersectional factors, caste, class, age, location, all come into play while determining their opportunities and challenges. What do we have adequate data and evidence to design strategies? If not, what should be the way forward in addressing these data challenges? Whoever wants to take that on.
I'll take
Vidya?
that. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ranjit, and thanks to all the speakers for those wonderful presentations, and also to the audience. Good afternoon to everybody. I think the point that you're raising on, do we have adequate data to look at, and even metrics to look at some of these questions that have been raised? The answer is somewhat. I would take a middle ground on that. You have some data sets, but they have incomplete information, and so therefore the need for primary data collection within the agri-food systems is still very, very relevant. Making a larger point, I'll just draw, and I'll take 2 minutes here to give you context of what do we mean when we're talking about participation of youth and women in the food system. So largely, it's not just agricultural production that we mean as an occupation, but it's also, the processing of food, and it goes beyond if you look at the value chain. And when we talk about agriculture, loosely, we just think of farms, right? That's the first thing that comes to our mind, but we have agriculture and allied activities, which comprises almost everything that you can think of, right, in terms of jobs. So we have the agriculture core production, which is your farms, but also dairy and livestock. Then you have fisheries, which is a large segment, and all of these often get missed in the debate and discussion. And there are a lot of women and youth engaged in those sectors as well. That's the first point. If we look at data systems, we don't have data that cuts across all these sectoral view. We don't have. And we talk about looking at intersectionalities within that, then the data is even more weak. So that's the first point, right? And we do need to take a view of this value chain approach as well as intersectoral approach when we're talking about data, because there's otherwise a lot of duplication. The second thing is it has to be context specific as well. We need more evidence coming from different contexts, which can then be synthesized to say that what is common and what is not common across different contexts. So these are two major points which I would like to make. Then when we talk about how to design data systems, what do we mean by engagement, right? Here I would invoke, the typical surveys that we capture is, do you engage in agricultural activities, right? That's not sufficient. We know that if, as Nizam was pointing out, if we know that agriculture is not even considered as a productive activity in the case of women and is gendered, then if you just ask the question of, are you engaged? Often you're going to get very, very varied responses. So we need a better understanding of how do we think of this engagement. And one of the ways which has been proved effective, and that, it's kind of contradictory to labor force participation surveys, is that when you look at time use and the way you measure, when you ask women, how much time do you spend on agriculture and related activities, then you see that actually there's a lot of engagement, right? But if you capture that in paid employment surveys, you might not find that engagement. So that's a paradox. So how do we resonate data that is emerging from these two different types of surveys? That's a question that we need to think of as a research community. Engagement to me means that somebody is engaging in that activity, paid, unpaid. That's a second classification. So time use is an effective manner in which we can capture that. And there are many studies that have been done, but there's a lot of progress to be made. So we do not have seasonal understanding of the engagement. We do not know how activity-wise, even within agriculture, women engage in agriculture across different states, across different contexts, not just India, but also globally. And across different cropping patterns, for example. And what is the difference in time engagement between landless laborers, smallholders, people who own larger fractions of land. So that's another intersectionality which we need to be concerned about as well. So these are some of the design and data that we need to think of if you're evolving in coming up with better systems to get data. Yeah.
Great,
Thanks.
thanks Vidya. Amrita, Bidesha, anything you'd like to add, supplement here?
Thanks. I want to thank CGIAR for having me here, and the presentations were really wonderful. And I also want to, I think my comments will echo some of what we've already heard, but I base my comments on village studies in rural Bihar that I've been involved in. And, just adding on to Vidya's point about the data, really, you spoke about the agriculture systems. We have, like, again, it's not that we don't have data. We have a fair number of data sets, and often we find excessive data and research in some areas. But having said that, something as fundamental as migration, we simply don't know how that works, right? And we don't know how that works because we don't have data. And let's go to the root of the whole issue. And for that, we need to understand the source region. We don't really understand very well how village production systems work, right? And outmigration and, what is the relationship of these village production systems with what's happening within the village, outside the village, that's non-farm work, and migration. So the whole relationship between agriculture, non-agriculture, and migration is something that we don't look at because we simply don't have enough data sources to look at that. And within migration also, it's really problematic because we don't understand where people are going as much as we would like to. We don't, if they're going to multiple destinations, we don't have any data, any national level data set that maps multiple destinations where migrants might be going. And closely related, we don't also have much understanding of intra-household dynamics of not only migration, for instance, intra-household dynamics related to lots of things. So if we want to understand the determinants of migrants, we rarely look at the gendered composition within households. We rarely look at the incomes within households and so on. So I think largely we are unable to then capture multiple activities done by individuals in the multiple spaces that they go to because we don't really have data capturing the multiple spaces. And also we sort of lack data looking at multiple activities the household is doing. So the relationship between the individual and the household and the market and we know very well, like even from the context of Bihar, you'll find very few households that are engaged only in agriculture or only in non-farm work. So what the empirical evidence shows very clearly that you have multiple activities, pluri-activities, and we just simply are unable to capture this. And this makes a lot of difference when we're looking at aggregate data because it doesn't add up. And I completely echo Vidya's point about the undervaluation of women's work and simple undercounting of women's work that still goes on. If you look at NSS data for workforce participation, it's very different, very low, about 4 times lower than what the IHT Bihar surveys capture using the same definitions or similar definitions. So clearly, we do need more disaggregated data, and we need to make sense of the disaggregated data with the aggregate data. So I think it works both ways.
Excellent. Thanks, Amrita. Bidisha, I see your hand up. And the other speakers as well, if you want to make a comment or have something to add, please do raise your hand on Zoom, and then you can intervene. Bidisha, over to you, please.
Thanks, Ranjita. And so I actually want to dwell a bit on the second part of your question that, with the data that we have, can we design effective strategies? And, the speakers before me have already highlighted gaps in the data, so I'll not, focus on that. But having said that, there are data sets. I mean, I would also go by Vidya's comment that somewhat, the data needs are met in some way. However, even with the kind of data that are available, they are not usable for decision making. Researchers are really not the ones who are taking the actual decisions in the ground, right? In policy implementation, it's the policy makers, the government who are taking the decision. The data that exists is really not in a form or accessible to governments or even or policymakers to base their or inform their decisions. The governments have a huge demand for data. What they don't have is the internal capacity to use existing agricultural data to feed into their decision making. And for that, they often rely on technical support teams and researchers such as us to universities to come up with the research. And this research exists in forms that cannot be assimilated by them. So research communication becomes very important. And that's actually one, one point that I think it would be good for this panel also to think about, that how can we make the data and the research that we do, feed into effective strategies that can be taken up. So yeah, I mean, so with whatever, what can we do with the best, with what we have, given that, the ideal is extremely high investment and that will take some time. It's very desirable, but how can we make do or make the best of what we have so far? I think that would be something that to think about. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much. And then Cher.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a very important discussion on measurement. Just want to add, there are ways for formal surveys to better capture women's work, and the International Conference of Labour Statisticians had adopted a definition of work back in 2013 that would support that, but not all governments, including India, has adopted that approach. And so that's, able to capture different forms of work, including the unpaid activities, in a better way. However, that said, I would just stress that in terms of, what the labour force surveys like NSS and then now the PLFS tell us is that, clearly women's work is undermeasured and underreported in rural areas, and potentially also in urban areas. But it still doesn't detract from the fact that women's participation in paid employment outside the home is low, right? So, I think it's important to better capture women's work in all its forms. But I think that, there's been a long running discussion in India about measurement. I think that is not a reason to say that women's participation isn't low outside the home in paid and decent productive employment. If you look at, and this is why it's important to disaggregate by sector, by region, rural, urban, etc., to look at where women are working, even as it's picked up in a labour force survey like the PLFS. So there are definitely methods that can be used to improve even formal collection of data on women's work, but at the same time, I think it's important to recognise what it is telling us as well.
Thanks, Cher. So basically, we have some data, we don't have some. We need more in some areas, but definitely better data across all these dimensions that we are talking about. And thanks for raising that important point of research and data communication in a manner that's accessible to policymakers, development practitioners. It isn't just enough to generate data. So thanks for that. And then a point that came across in some of the presentations that we've heard was about strengthening these farm and non-farm linkages and be able to diversify the incomes for women, young people, understanding and appreciating their aspirations and accounting for them as we design some of these strategies. Any thoughts on that? How can we strengthen that side of research, analysis, and action? Yeah, Amrita, go ahead, please.
Okay, so I think the whole relationship between farm, non-farm, and migration is something it's important. I'll just take from Tembe's point. When she spoke about how you think when it's rural, it's agriculture, right? And even in Bihar, for instance, which is 90% rural, 90% population lives in rural areas as per our census. We very well see in our surveys now that the share of agriculture in incomes has declined from 53% to 21% between 98 and 2016. So as late as 2016, only about 20% of the income was coming from agriculture. And you see a similar decline for men and women working in agriculture. So for instance, the decline for men who reported agriculture as a primary occupation fell from 49% to 21% this period. And for women, it was 95% to 38%. So if we are there, that, already agriculture, even in a state like Bihar, is at the margins of the economy, then how do we understand its relationship with the non-farm, right? And non-farm, unfortunately hasn't been able to take off. And that's largely because of migration. So we need to then look at it as a triangle, right? And so you have a situation where the lack of non-farm first pushes the migration, and then at the same time, migration is the consequence of the lack of non-farm. So that relationship is really important. And I think this really links to Priya's point about aspirations, right? What is it that young people want to do? So it is true, young people don't want to work in agriculture largely, but they also, and therefore they migrate. But the paradox here also is, if young people have jobs that pay well in the non-farm sector, decent job, they are very willing to work there. When we do qualitative work with migrants, you understand, they prefer to work in the village if they're able to get decent work of a particular kind, right? And if we link this up with employment opportunities, and then, you take a macro view of how it is, in the growth process has been such that it has not generated employment. And when employment declined between 11, 12 and 17, 18 by 6 million for the first time, the rural areas and those at the lower end of the social hierarchy bore the brunt of this. So the point I'm really trying to make is that those jobs simply don't exist in the rural in terms of non-farm. And when that intersects with people not wanting to work in the farm, then migration needs to be seen from that perspective of the macroeconomy, where there's demand for labor there in the urban areas. So and that's where I think the whole paradox of aspirations, do they really want to work in the urban areas, whether they're willing to work in the rural, that is something we need to look at it more critically, with more nuance, with more qualitative studies.
Right, great. Yeah, thanks.
Just adding to that, yes. I think the point which she's making is basically from the perspective of individual maximization, whether that is welfare or whether we're talking about aspirations. But one other point which would really aid policy and programs is more disaggregated data at the administrative levels of districts. So far in the Indian context, we see state level data that's coming in, but I think we need more disaggregated data of the rural productivity and non-farm activity, rural activity in production systems and activity in non-farm systems at the district level, because there are large interstate variations which often get missed in this design of policies. And what we see in the case of nutritional outcomes is there is a huge variation across districts, and there is spatial clustering that is happening. So in terms of effectively designing data systems which then aid policy, it's important to go down to district level statistics while we work on micro foundational aspects of what do we maximize? Is that welfare? Is that aspirations? Is that income? Yeah.
Great, thanks. Vidisha?
I think a low-hanging fruit, to link farm and non-farm sectors is, and that also came out very nicely in Fembi's presentation, was around agro-processing and agro-services, basically, and looking at the post-harvest and the services support sector that assists the production systems. Because rural economy, as we've all agreed, is not just about crop cultivation; it's beyond that. And where is the value here? I think the value here is that it's not just about generating employment for income for women. Yes, women are involved in crop systems and production, but are they gainfully employed? Are they getting an income that has value? That can at some point be transformative. These there is actually potential to involve women in these kind of roles, and I'll just give you a few examples. For women in particular, ag processing might have an opportunity because women are usually involved in post-harvest activities anyway. If you look at the aquacultural value chain, after the fish is brought in, the drying of fish, making fish powder and so on are all done by women. It's just that these are not marketed and are used completely for home consumption. So there's already some base of women in the post-harvest processing. It's already being done. So what is the opportunity here to deliver value for women? What is needed is quality upgrading and control of the agro-processing of the process itself, and to do it at a scale that is viable. Here again, I'm bringing in viable because now I want to focus a bit more on, not just getting women work, but providing women value for the work that they do. And scale is important because it needs to be a minimum viable scale is needed. If value has to be given to women, if it has to be in some way linked to markets. And this is where actually there are some really good examples that that CGIAR is working in. One of them is called the RUDI model, which has been tested by SEWA in Gujarat. This is really about training and empowering women to become to give employment in women in local processing centers and use these same women as for marketing of these local products. It's a very local economy focused model. It has worked in Gujarat. We are working with SEWA and Imago Global Grassroots to translate this model with the government at a scale that is bigger. So that's where the agropreneurs are coming in. There are also similarly there are projects that are being supported that we are working on which are focusing again on local products. Women in Rajasthan harvest chilies from their background from their backyard, process them and use the chili powder for their own household consumption. Can collectivizing these women, making producer groups of them, enable and branding this product? The need for to brand and to market it in urban areas, can it generate value for women in a way that it can be transformative? It pushes them a bit beyond the 10 rupees, 15 rupees that they get from working in agriculture. So there, but there's a serious gap in actual rigorous studies of large-scale studies, or even studies of adequate sample on what happens, what are the opportunities for women post-harvest. And there are what's happening in food management, what's happening in food processing. There's a huge gap there. And I think as more research comes in, there'll be a lot more illumination of this rather gray area, I would say.
Thanks, Vidisha. Thembi, I'm not ignoring you, but we are at time and we've been asked to wrap up fairly quickly. So I want to quickly see if there are one or two questions from the audience which we can field very quickly. Yes, please. Please.
Actually, you spoke, and then the beginning first speaker also spoke about the technology, gender technology. So yes, gender technology. So what gender of female may be economic variable and biological variable. So what is your same is you in the beginning you said that is not only writing paper and all those, we do something more also. So what else you are doing, because everything discussed here is about value addition, making it something more so that it is sustainable. Young people remain in the rural area, so as if their income increases. So everything will be done if they have appropriate kind of technology. And if it is gendered, it is going to be gendered. So what is your say and what you are doing in that direction?
I think Vidya is a specialist in that area. I'll pass it on to her.
Yeah, so what my research showed, we did a evidence collective on looking at what technologies mean. So first of all, how are activities in agriculture conducted? That is itself gendered. So most of the manual activities that are happening in agricultural production systems are actually being done by women. For example, weeding, harvesting of cotton, harvesting of transplanting of rice, which are really, really manually intensive. And all the initially intensive activities, such as the land preparation, where you usually traditionally used to see bullocks, right? I mean, so now that has been mechanized, and that is largely male oriented. So now we have a scenario where most of women in agriculture, in production, are engaged in manual activities, which are very, very burden oriented for their health as well, and it has nutritional consequences as well, health and nutritional consequences, and that we know. The solution oriented approach to that is, can we provide labor saving technologies in agriculture? And what we find is that, well, most of the design and implementation, design part of the products which are happening in agriculture are not happening taking into account women, right? Because we do not understand this activity-wise classification of who's engaged in research. And so we've spoken to multiple stakeholders in the project that I'm doing. We've spoken to manufacturers of technology, we've spoken to women, men on farm, and what we find is a complete lack of understanding of what women desire in technology, what kind of technology is suitable, and how can they then translate some of the time reductions or burden reductions that can happen. So I think we need a lot more research. There are tools available in the agricultural sciences to which women can adopt, and that can significantly reduce some of the burden in the manual activities they're engaged in, while also make it remunerative. But the adoption is, but there is no focus on that. So increasingly that kind of work, dissemination of that research and policy engagement needs to be done to make sure that women adopt these technologies which are for their better health and nutrition.
Thanks, Vidya. And there's a lot more on technologies, but we just don't have the time to do that now. So by way of wrapping up, I'm going to ask each of the speakers and the panelists here to give us in one sentence, what's the key message you want all of us to take away from this room today? One sentence only. Okay, let's start with the speakers. Nozomi, you get to go first.
Okay, one sentence. I think women's domestic and care work are under recognized, under evaluated, and under reported. That is an area we should remind today. Thank you.
Thanks, Nozomi. Brilliant. Vidisha, I'm going in the order I see on my screen here.
Measuring women's work and making sure that women get value for their work.
Thank you. Share.
Economists should talk more to agri-foods experts, and then we should look more at these interlinkages between agriculture and non-agriculture.
Thanks, Share. You stole my words. Priya.
I think that we need to pay more attention to the aspirations of young people and how that links up with agriculture, migration and agriculture. Thanks.
MB?
Enhance the voice of young people in agriculture policy research by listening to them and actively engaging them.
Thanks. Nicolene.
I would say ditto to everything that everybody said, and include that we do need to become more intelligent and nuanced on our framing, because we do make sweeping statements, and there's so much more
Thanks. Amrita?
I think we need to look at rural and urban as not mutually exclusive, but the interactions and also the continuum between the two.
Thank you. Vidya has the last word.
I think we need a lot more research in resilience and coping mechanisms within which also looking at individuals and intra-household dynamics.
Thank you so much. And I think interdisciplinarity is the key to finding effective solutions. Thank you so much for being here, for your participation. Sorry, this should have been longer, but thank you so much to all the speakers and the panelists, those who traveled, those who couldn't. And it would be remiss if I didn't thank my colleagues, Bhim and Niyati, who organized this panel. Thank you so much.
I have an announcement to make. So after this, there's a culture program at the Convocation Hall. So a bus will pick you up from the LHC main gate at 7:30. So please be there at the main gate of LHC at 7:30. Thank you.